The last thing Rhen Calder saw clearly was Dorian Vess's face, close enough to read every word he wasn't saying. In the half-second before the Ashen Choir's second, Nova hit the line Rhen's ward should have still been holding. Ward integrity failed. He'd burned the ward's emergency reserve 4 minutes early. Not because he panicked. Because Dorian pushed past the safe engagement window for a solo finishing blow the cameras would actually credit to him, and someone had to eat the retaliation Nova meant for the whole team when it came. Rhen made that call in under a second. He'd had 3 years of practice making it. The Nova took the ward down in one sustained burn, the kind of failure that doesn't announce itself gradually, just stops existing between one heartbeat and the next. Rhen remembered the specific silence of it, no alarm, no warning chime, just the absence of a pressure he'd been holding against his own chest for 3 years suddenly gone, and the cold, certain understanding of exactly what was coming through the gap it left. Dorian saw the ward drop. Dorian said nothing. He didn't need to. The raid footage later showed exactly what there was nothing anyone could have done was covering for. In the 2 full seconds, Dorian had to call a retreat and didn't, because retreating meant losing the kill. Rhen's last conscious thought wasn't fear. It was a strange, almost clerical bitterness, the certainty that his official cause of death report would list ward failure, unavoidable, that the kill board would register nothing at all, because it had never once had a column for what he'd actually spent 3 years doing. Then a girl's voice, 16 years old and much too late, telling him to hold on to something he no longer had the strength to hold. None of them knew that dying wasn't going to be the end of Rhen Calder's story. It was going to be the reason he finally got the 7 years back that the kill board never once thought he'd earned. Reclassification error, temporal anomaly detected. Rhen woke up on a hard bench in the awakening trial hall, 18 years old, hands shaking around a trial marker he hadn't held in 7 years, surrounded by 200 other marked 18-year-olds waiting for a gate-forged crystal to decide the rest of their lives. He knew this room. He knew the exact order the names would be called in. He knew, with a certainty that made his stomach turn, that in about 6 minutes the boy 3 seats down was going to awaken a mid-tier striker class and spend the next hour being congratulated by people who wouldn't remember his name in a year. He also knew what he himself was about to awaken, because he'd lived this exact morning already and hated every version of how it had gone the first time. A proctor with a clipboard worked down the row, calling names in the same flat rhythm Rhen remembered from a lifetime he wasn't supposed to still have access to. He watched the boy 3 seats down awaken striker, watched the small crowd of relatives near the exit applaud, and felt nothing but a strange, distant grief for how much time that boy was going to spend chasing a board ranking that would matter to absolutely no one in the specific hour it mattered whether anyone survived a collapsing gate. He tried, briefly, to remember if that boy's name had ever crossed a casualty report in his first life, and couldn't recall one either way, which felt like its own small tragedy, a whole life he'd apparently shared a trial hall bench with and never once thought about again. Calder Rhen. The trial marker went cold blue, then a pale, unglamorous silver gray that every proctor in the hall recognized immediately and reacted to with the same practiced, polite disappointment. A class-awakened warder. A ripple of quiet condescension moved through the watching crowd, the exact same ripple Rhen remembered from 7 years ago, except this time he wasn't 18 and naive about what it meant. He knew precisely how little the kill board would ever credit a warder for, and precisely how many people that same worthless class was going to end up keeping alive over the next 7 years, himself very much included, right up until the one time it wasn't allowed to. Warder, the proctor said, already reaching for the next candidate's file, not unkind, just efficient in a way that made the dismissal worse. Support division intake is through the East Corridor. Don't expect a sponsor booth this year, striker pool's unusually deep. He didn't correct anyone's assumptions. He didn't announce what he knew. A trial candidate who claimed to remember a life that hadn't happened yet would get flagged, studied, possibly quarantined by the Vanguard Assembly's Anomaly Division before he ever got the chance to do anything useful with what he'd been given back. Rhen had exactly one advantage this life had that the last one didn't, and it wasn't his class. It was silence. Little did the proctors processing his unremarkable paperwork know. The quiet 18-year-old warder walking out of the trial hall that afternoon already knew the exact date, 7 years out, that a gate called the Ashen Choir was supposed to open, the exact team roster that was supposed to answer it, and the exact half-second his own ward was supposed to fail because of a decision someone else was going to make on purpose. What he didn't know yet was that the moment he skipped his own first mistake, the schedule he remembered stopped being a schedule at all. Timeline divergence monitoring. The first thing Rhen did with his second chance wasn't chase Dorian Vale. It was walk past the East Corridor's Support Division intake desk entirely, out toward the crumbling training annex at the trial hall's far edge, where a discredited former warder named Varric Asen had been teaching an empty room for 6 years, ever since the Vanguard Assembly stripped his instructor's license over a report nobody wanted published. The annex door stuck. Rhen remembered that too, and pulled it the specific way that actually opened it, which was the first thing that made Varric look up sharply from the ward lattice he was maintaining alone in the corner, the kind of exhausting, invisible upkeep that kept the old shield array from collapsing on itself. "You're the 7th person to wander in here by accident this month," Varric said. "The exit's behind you." "I'm not lost," Rhen said. "I read your report." That got Varric to set down his tools entirely. Nobody read that report. Rhen knew because in his first life he hadn't either, not until 3 years into Duskward Vanguard when a senior warder mentioned it in passing, and he never followed up, too busy being grateful for a team slot at all to ask why the man who'd predicted exactly the failure mode that eventually killed him had been laughed out of the assembly for saying it out loud first. "Which part?" Varric said, testing him, the wary tone of a man who'd been mocked for this specifically enough times to expect it again. "The part where you said ranking survival at 0 and kills at everything guarantees someone eventually dies to buy someone else a highlight reel," Rhen said. "You were right. I'd like you to teach me so it doesn't happen to me specifically." Varric studied him a long moment, the particular expression of a man deciding whether he was being mocked one more time. "Most people who quote that report back to me are quoting it to be cruel. Assembly instructors used it as a joke in orientation lectures for 2 years. He looked Rhen over again, differently this time. "You don't sound like you're joking." "I'm not," Rhen said. "I know what it costs when nobody teaches a warder how to survive their own class properly. I'd like the 7 years back that it usually takes to learn that the hard way." Whatever Varric saw in Rhen's face, it wasn't mockery, and for the first time in 6 years he stepped aside from the annex door. Ward technique sustained cycling locked. Real warder training turned out to be nothing like the 11 rushed lectures Rhen remembered receiving his first time through, squeezed between higher priority striker coursework because the assembly's limited instructor hours went where the kill board pointed them. Varric drilled him instead on sustained ward cycling, the technique for splitting a barrier's output across a rotating series of smaller wards instead of one large one that failed catastrophically the instant its reserve ran out. The exact technique that, in a version of events only Rhen remembered, hadn't been taught to him in time to save his own life. Most warders burn their whole reserve holding one line because that's the only technique anyone bothered showing them, Varric said, watching Rhen collapse for the 4th time that week trying to hold 3 rotating wards at once. You do that against anything serious and the moment it fails completely, with nothing left to catch what comes through. "I know," Rhen said, quieter than the correction warranted, and Varric, who didn't yet understand exactly how Rhen knew, let it go. The 3rd rotation failed the way it always failed that first month, all at once, a stuttering collapse Rhen felt in his chest before he saw it in the light, the sensation of holding 3 separate weights on 3 separate ropes and losing the exact millisecond when one of them started slipping, so that by the time his hands understood what was happening, all 3 were already gone. He hit the annex floor hard enough to bruise, breath knocked flat, and lay there long enough that Varric had to ask if he was still conscious before he answered. Again, Rhen said from the floor before Varric had finished asking. "You've done that drill 11 times today." "Then I'll do it 12. He pushed himself upright, forearms shaking, the specific exhaustion of a body relearning something it had never actually been taught right the first time. "I don't get to be bad at this." "Not again." Varric didn't argue. He adjusted Rhen's stance a half-inch, corrected the angle of his left hand, and said nothing about the again, not the drill count, the other one, filing it away the way a careful man files away a detail he isn't ready to ask about yet. The drills got harder before they got easier. Rhen spent whole weeks unable to hold a second rotation without the first collapsing, Varric correcting his reserve-splitting math with the patient, exacting precision of a man who'd clearly run these exact numbers against his own failures decades earlier, and never gotten the chance to teach anyone properly before the assembly took the chance away from him. By the 5th month, Rhen could hold 2 wards indefinitely. By the 7th, 3, the specific configuration he remembered needing and never having on the night that mattered. 8 months into that training cycle, Myra Solt awakened warder in the same trial hall, to the same ripple of quiet disappointment Rhen remembered receiving himself, except this time he was standing close enough to the exit doors to watch it happen to someone else and recognize every part of it. Class awakened warder. In his first life, Rhen never met Myra Solt until the night she tried to drag his already dying body out of the Ashen Choir's collapse zone, 7 years too late for either of them. A 16-year-old rookie nobody had bothered training because warders weren't worth the assembly's limited instructor hours. She'd gotten his body 15 feet before the collapse caught them both, and the last thing Rhen remembered of that night before this one was her voice telling him to hold on to something he no longer had the strength to hold. This time, he was waiting by the annex door before she'd even finished walking out of the trial hall. "Warder training's this way," Rhen said. "If you want it." "Nobody offered it to me the first time I asked," Myra said flat, already braced for the same door to close the way every other door had that week. Up close, she looked younger than Rhen remembered her ever being, though he supposed that made sense. The version of her he carried in his memory had already survived a war zone by the time he really looked at her. "I'm not the assembly," Rhen said. "Doors open." Little did Myra know, agreeing to walk through it was the single choice that ensured she'd survive a night that, in a version of events only Rhen remembered, she hadn't. Varric took to her fast, faster than he'd taken to Rhen, in the particular way of a teacher who recognized in a new student the same stubborn refusal to accept a kill board's verdict on their own worth that had gotten him blacklisted in the first place. She asked better questions than Rhen had at her stage, sharper, more skeptical of the technique until she'd personally verified it worked, which Varric openly admitted he preferred to blind trust. Rhen watched them work through cycling drills he'd needed a real fight and a dying ally to learn properly the first time, and felt something settle in his chest that the kill board had never once tracked and never would, the quiet, specific satisfaction of a mistake not getting the chance to repeat itself. "Why do you care this much?" Myra asked him once, months in, after a session that left all 3 of them wrung out on the annex floor. "You already closed 4 gates clean before I even awakened. You don't need a training partner." "I had a bad first year," Rhen said, which was true in every sense she couldn't verify. "I don't want yours to look like mine did." Threshold integrity rising. 3 months later, on a routine minor gate closure Rhen steered toward with foreknowledge nobody else had, the bloom stage aberration came up out of the containment crater faster than the survey report had estimated, mass still knitting itself together out of raw contamination. 3 civilian evacuees still 50 feet short of the safe perimeter when it turned toward the sound of them running. "I've got the evacuees," Rhen called, already moving, already committing his own line to the wrong angle to buy the distance. "Hold it." "Alone?" Myra's voice cracked once, not with fear exactly, more the specific vertigo of a first solo call arriving faster than she'd expected it to. "You've held 2 rotations in drills for a month. This is one aberration, not a gate collapse." "Hold it." She held it. 11 seconds, alone, the amber gold line thinning twice under the strain and catching itself both times on the exact reserve-splitting rhythm Varric had drilled into her hands until it stopped being math and started being reflex. The bloom stage aberration's weight slamming into a barrier that bent and did not break. Rhen got the evacuees clear with 4 seconds to spare before the ward's job was done and the aberration, cut off from anything left to reach, went still. The gate closed clean behind it, quiet as a held breath finally let go. No kill board credit. No headlines. 3 civilian evacuees and 1 exhausted rookie warder walked away from a gate that, in the schedule Rhen remembered, hadn't been scheduled to destabilize for another year and a half. "That's the second one this month that opened early," Myra said afterward, still catching her breath, more curious than alarmed. "Is that normal?" "No," Rhen said, and didn't say anything else about it that night, though the worse feeling he'd been sitting on for weeks got a little harder to keep swallowing. Rhen never rejoined Duskward Vanguard. He didn't need to chase a team slot he already knew the ending of. Instead, over the following 2 years, he and Myra built something the kill board had no column for, a track record of minor and mid-tier gate closures with a casualty count of 0, quietly known among the Vanguard Assembly's actual field coordinators, the people who mattered, not the ones who handed out headlines, as the 2 warders you requested if you actually wanted your team to come home. Ward uptime 100%, 37 consecutive closures. Field crews started calling them the Ghost Warders, half joking, because their closures never made the public board updates and never generated a single trending clip, as if the work itself were happening somewhere just outside where the cameras usually pointed. Rhen didn't mind the name. It was, he thought privately, the most accurate thing anyone had ever called him. The closure that earned Kest's personal attention wasn't a dramatic one, which was exactly the point. A mid-tier gate had been quietly destabilizing under an evacuation convoy's overnight rest stop, the kind of routine infrastructure failure that never made a headline because nothing dramatic enough happened to report, because Rhen and Myra got there 6 hours ahead of the convoy's arrival, mapped the gate's actual failure window against the one Rhen remembered from a life where this exact convoy had lost 11 people to a surge nobody saw coming, and had a rotating ward silently stabilizing the rest stop's perimeter before a single passenger unpacked a bedroll. Nobody at that convoy ever knew a gate had been failing under their feet. That was the entire job done correctly, a disaster that never got the chance to become a story. "You could take a board-ranked contract any week you wanted," Captain Yolanda Kest told him, weeks after that convoy filed a routine after-arrival report that mentioned nothing unusual at all, reviewing a coordination request she'd personally routed his way instead of posting publicly, the 4th time that year. "You know that." "I know what a board-ranked contract usually costs," Rhen said, and didn't elaborate, and Kest, who'd commanded enough teams to recognize a man who'd already paid a price he wasn't naming, didn't push. She kept routing him requests anyway, quietly, off the public board, the way a coordinator does when she's stopped fully trusting the incentive structure she still officially serves. Once, after a closure that saved an entire evacuation convoy nobody outside the Assembly's internal logs ever heard about, she stayed after the debrief long enough to ask a question she'd clearly been sitting on. 31 closures. 0 casualties. Why isn't every field coordinator in this assembly begging you to take a permanent team command? Because command needs a board ranking to get budget approved, Rhen said. And I don't have one and never will, as long as the board only counts one thing. Kest didn't have an answer for that. It was the first sign, though Rhen didn't know it yet, that her own institutional blindness had a crack in it wide enough to eventually matter. Little did Kest know, she was about to hand Rhen Calder a coordination request for a joint operation that would put him in the same briefing room as Dorian Vess for the first time since a trial hall neither of them remembered the same way. Duskward Vanguard needed backup warders for a gate stabilization run gone unexpectedly volatile, one more small divergence in a pattern Rhen was quietly, privately starting to track. He almost said no. He said yes instead, because Myra needed the field experience, and because some part of him had never actually stopped wanting to see Dorian Vess's face again while he still had the ability to do something about what he saw there. Timeline divergence accelerating. Dorian Vess at 22 was every bit as charismatic as Rhen remembered him being at 29, and every bit as hungry underneath it, in a way Rhen now recognized instantly instead of taking 3 years and a funeral to notice. "Warder backup," Dorian said, sizing Rhen up in the briefing room with the easy, practiced warmth of a man who'd learned exactly how to make people feel chosen. "Cass says you're good. Says you don't miss." "I don't," Rhen said. "Neither do I," Dorian said, and smiled the exact smile Rhen remembered from 100 sponsor clips, the one that had never once, in 7 years, reached the specific coldness underneath it that only became visible when something inconvenient happened to somebody standing outside his kill shot angle. The gate stabilization went clean for the first 40 minutes, textbook Dorian's striker instincts every bit as sharp in practice as they were in the highlight reels, which Rhen had to admit privately was part of what made him so dangerous. The recklessness wasn't a flaw in his skill, it rode alongside genuine talent, which was exactly why nobody around him had ever been forced to question it. Then a secondary tremor split the containment zone, and a junior striker named Osai Rhen got pinned under collapsing stonework 15 feet outside Dorian's optimal killshot angle on the aberration surging toward them both. Rhen watched Dorian do the math in under a second, the same fast, practiced calculation Rhen had watched him make once before from the wrong end of it. Rescue Os, and lose the clean solo kill the footage would have made his, or take the shot, trust someone else's ward to cover the 15 feet he wasn't going to. Dorian took the shot. "Ward him," Dorian called out, already moving, already knowing exactly whose job that now was. Ward deployed. Rhen's ward caught Osai a half-second before the aberration's collapsing debris would have. "Clean. No injuries." Dorian got his kill shot footage, and later in the after-action debrief described the sequence as trusting my team to cover the gap. The same phrase, Rhen now understood with a cold, specific clarity that Dorian had probably used about him too, in a version of the story only Rhen had lived to remember. Osai found Rhen afterward alone, still shaking slightly from a fall that should have broken both legs. "He didn't even look back to check if I was clear," Osai said, quieter than the debrief room, the kind of thing you only say once you're sure nobody official is recording it. "I've flown with him 2 years. First time I really noticed that." "Now you'll notice it every time," Rhen said, not unkindly, and Osai's expression told him the seed had already taken root, small and slow, the first crack in someone else's version of Dorian Vess that Rhen hadn't had to force. Little did Dorian know, the warder who just quietly saved a stranger's life to protect his highlight reel was the same man he was going to let die making the identical call 7 years from now, in a version of events that no longer had to happen at all. Rhen didn't accuse him. Not yet. He had no proof beyond a memory nobody else could verify, and an accusation with no proof would end with Rhen quarantined by the Assembly's Anomaly Division and Dorian's reputation completely untouched. He filed it away the way he'd filed away every other piece of foreknowledge that wasn't ready to be spent yet, and told himself the same thing he'd been telling himself for 2 years. The point was never revenge. The point was making sure nobody paid the price for Dorian Vess's math again. Himself included. In the weeks before the report, the signs were small enough that Rhen almost let himself believe they weren't signs at all. A minor gate 2 districts over came in a full 9 days ahead of its survey window, then another, then a third closure that should have been routine, turning up a bloom stage aberration with mass better suited to a gate twice its rank. He started tracking the drift in a notebook he kept in the annex, dates against the schedule only he remembered, and told himself for 2 weeks running that a pattern of 3 data points wasn't a pattern at all. It was the 4th one, a full month early, that made him stop telling himself that. Gate instability detected, designation, Ashen Choir. The report came through the Vanguard Assembly's field network on an otherwise ordinary evening, and Rhen read it standing perfectly still in Varick's annex, because the designation at the top of it was the one designation in the entire world he'd been dreading seeing early. "That's not possible," Varick said, reading over his shoulder, the closest Rhen had ever heard the old man come to alarm. Ashen class gates don't destabilize 4 years ahead of their bloom cycle. They don't destabilize at all without a trigger event. "I might be the trigger event," Rhen said quietly, and told him everything, 7 years of it, for the first time out loud to another living person. The raid, the Nova, Dorian's silence, the girl who'd arrived too late. The exact designation now sitting on the report in front of them, both years ahead of the schedule only he had ever known. Varick didn't call him insane. He didn't call the Assembly's anomaly division either, which Rhen understood once the old man explained it, as the closest thing to an act of faith Varick Aasen had left in him after 6 years of being disbelieved himself. He sat with it a long moment, running old calculations Rhen recognized from the annex's ward theory texts before he spoke again. Gates don't destabilize randomly. Something feeds them, unresolved instability, unclosed threat mass, the specific kind of volatility a region accumulates when danger doesn't get properly discharged. He crossed to the annex's old ward lattice array and pulled up a diagnostic overlay Rhen had walked past 100 times without really looking at. A faint webwork of pale amber gold lines connecting every gate in the region like a nervous system. "Watch what happens to the load when I model a closure that goes wrong instead of one that goes clean." He traced a finger along one line, it flared and dimmed, the excess visibly rerouting itself down the webwork toward the largest, brightest node on the display. "Now watch what happens when the closure goes right instead." He ran it again. "Clean this time." The excess didn't dissipate, it simply had nowhere else built into the model to go, and slid down the exact same line toward the exact same node, thicker than before. "That's not a difference in outcome," Varick said quietly. "That's a difference in who's holding the bill." He looked up. "Every closure you and Myra ran clean, every death that didn't happen the way you remembered it happening, that mass has to go somewhere. I think it's been accumulating in the largest unclosed gate on the board. I think you've been feeding the Ashen Choir every good thing you've done for 2 years without knowing it." Rhen stared at the brightest node on the display a long moment before he trusted himself to answer. "So the better I do, the worse this gets. Or the better prepared you are when it finally comes due," Varick said. "You've spent 2 years training for exactly this fight without knowing it had a deadline. I'd call that the opposite of a mistake. Threshold integrity critical." Little did the Vanguard Assembly's leadership know, reviewing an unscheduled instability report they filed as a low-priority anomaly, that the warder they'd never once ranked on any board was the only living person who understood exactly what was destabilizing 4 years early, and exactly why. Worse, the Assembly's automatic response protocol, unaware of any of it, had already begun assembling a response roster. Rhen recognized every name on it before it finished loading. Duskward Vanguard. Dorian Vess as lead striker. The exact team he remembered dying beside, 7 years too early, with a fraction of the preparation time he'd counted on having. He didn't sleep that night. Myra found him still in the annex at dawn, staring at the same report. "You look like you already lost," she said. I already did once, Rhen said. I'm trying to remember that's not the same thing as losing again. He spent the walk to Kest's office running the same argument in both directions and arriving nowhere new either time. Warn her everything, and the anomaly division would have him quarantined before the sentence finished. Myra and Varick's names attached to the file right alongside his, every year of quiet credibility they'd built together spent in a single afternoon on a truth nobody could verify. Warn her nothing, and Duskward Vanguard walked into the Ashen Choir with a gait destabilized years ahead of any real preparation and a striker who'd already gotten one warder killed, making the exact call he was about to make again. There wasn't a version of the conversation where he got to keep both the truth and the trust it would cost him. There'd never been one. He just hadn't had to stand outside her door and actually feel the weight of that trade before. You're not cleared for this deployment, Kest told him, reading the roster herself, apology already in her voice before Rhen said a word. Ashen Class response requires board-verified combat experience. You and Solt don't have the confirmed kills on record, whatever your actual closure count says. Then clear us as attached support, Rhen said. Not roster. Support. You've rooted me enough off-book work the last 2 years to know exactly what that ward-up time record is worth in a room like this one. Kest looked at him for a long moment, the same crack in her institutional blindness that had let her keep quietly favoring him for 2 years, widening now into something closer to a decision. Give me one reason the Assembly would sign off on a support attachment nobody asked for. Because Dorian Vess is going to make a call under pressure that gets someone on that team killed, Rhen said, flat, final, the closest he'd come yet to saying it outright to someone with the power to act on it. I can't prove it yet. I can be standing close enough to stop it when it happens. That's a serious accusation with no evidence behind it, Kest said, though something in her voice suggested she'd already run her own quiet version of that same suspicion more than once, watching Dorian's after-action reports over the years and never quite finding the words for what bothered her about them. I know, Rhen said. I'm not asking you to believe the accusation. I'm asking you to let a support unit with 100% survival record stand near your team on the one deployment where it might matter more than it ever has. Little did Kest know she was about to make the single decision that determined whether the version of the Ashen Choir raid Rhen remembered was going to repeat itself exactly, or not at all. She signed the attachment order. Deployment authorized attached support, R. CALDERM. SOLT. Varick came too, off the books entirely, the first field deployment he'd taken in 6 years. Someone competent needs to be running reserve ward calculations who isn't emotionally compromised, he said, which both of them understood was Varick's way of saying he wasn't letting either of his students walk into this without him. He spent the night before deployment recalibrating both their reserve arrays personally, hands steadier than Rhen had ever seen them, and said only one more thing before they left the annex for the last time before the raid. Whatever happens out there, you already changed the ending once by choosing differently at a trial hall bench. Don't forget you have that same choice again every single second this fight runs. The Ashen Choir's containment zone looked exactly like Rhen remembered it, down to the specific angle of shattered stone at the entrance, and for the first several minutes of the engagement, so did everything else. Dorian's opening sequence, the choir's first phase attack pattern, the exact tremor timing Rhen had spent 7 years worth of nightmares replaying. Ward deployed primary line. Feels familiar? Myra asked over the comm, close enough to see his jaw tighten at the first tremor. Too familiar, Rhen said. Stay on rotation exactly like we drilled. Don't improvise whatever you see. Then the choir's second phase Nova began charging early, faster than Wren's memory said it should, one more small divergence stacking onto all the others, and Dorian, seeing an opening for the same kind of solo finishing blow that had built his entire reputation, started pushing past the safe engagement window exactly the way Rhen remembered him doing once before. "Ves, fall back to formation," Kest ordered over the comm, seeing it too this time, watching in real time the pattern Rhen had warned her about. Dorian didn't fall back. Some things Rhen understood in that instant weren't a trigger event or a divergence at all. They were just who Dorian Vess had always been in every version of this story. But this time, Rhen wasn't running one overextended ward alone on a hard reserve limit. He had 2 years of Varric's cycling technique, a rotation partner who'd trained for exactly this, and a mentor calculating reserve output in real time instead of finding out after the fact what it had cost. "Cycle to secondary now," Rhen called to Myra, and she was already moving, already exactly where the technique needed her to be, the ward rotating from Ren's line to hers a full 2 seconds before his reserve would have hit the same hard failure point that had killed him once. Ward cycling, secondary line active. The Nova hit. The line held. Dorian's solo finishing blow landed clean, and for one suspended half-second, it looked like it was going to end exactly the way his reputation always claimed his reckless plays ended. Perfectly, gloriously, with no cost attached. Then the choir's actual killing counterstrike came, the one Rhen remembered arriving a half-second after everyone assumed the fight was already won, aimed squarely at the exposed gap Dorian's overextension had left in the team's formation, the gap that, in Ren's first life, only his own body had been standing in to cover. This time, Rhen wasn't covering that gap alone, and he wasn't the only one who saw it coming. "Cycling won't reach him in time," Varric said over the comm, already recalculating, already seeing the same math Rhen was. "Not from your position." "Then I move," Rhen said and did, closing the 15 feet between his line and Dorian's exposed flank at a dead sprint. Ward reserve already redirected, because some choices, it turned out, he was always going to make the same way twice, not for Dorian's sake, but because letting the counterstrike land on anyone, even the man who'd let him die once, was never actually the point of any of this. Ward integrity holding. The barrier caught the killing blow a body's length from Dorian Vess, close enough that Dorian finally, for the first time in either version of this story, saw exactly what it looked like when someone else's ward stood between him and a mistake he'd made on purpose. For one raw, unguarded second, the practiced charisma dropped entirely off his face, and what was underneath it looked less like guilt and more like genuine, uncomprehending shock that the gap he'd left had actually mattered to someone standing far enough away to have simply let it happen. "Fall back to formation," Rhen said, quiet, exhausted, no anger left in his voice by that point, just the flat certainty of a man who'd already died once knowing exactly what standing there cost. "Now, before I have to do that twice in one fight." The Ashen Choir sealed 40 minutes later, ahead of any casualty, the first S+ gate closure in the Assembly's records with a full attached support unit and 0 confirmed deaths. A result the automatic kill board update process had no column to properly credit, because none of the warders who'd made it possible had a single confirmed kill between them. Gate SCALED casualties, 0. The after-action review took 3 days. Kest submitted the full field record herself this time, unedited, including the exact sequence of Dorian's overextension and the exact moment Ren's redirected ward had caught a killing blow that would otherwise have found either Dorian or the gap he'd left behind him. Osa corroborated the pattern independently, unprompted, describing the stabilization mission months earlier in detail nobody on the review board had thought to ask about until that point. Neither testimony was framed as an accusation. Both were framed as exactly what they were, a factual account of who had actually kept a raid team alive repeatedly without ever once being asked to prove it. Dorian Vess wasn't stripped of his rank. The Assembly wasn't in the business of publicly humiliating its highest kill board earner over a save that had, technically, worked. But his next 3 contract requests for solo-credited deployments were quietly declined, rooted instead toward mandatory joint operations with support review sign-off. And for the first time in either version of his career, Dorian Vess had to sit in a briefing room and listen to a warder's ward cycling calculations before a mission plan got approved instead of after a mission went wrong. "You could have let it hit me," Dorian said afterward, alone, no cameras, the closest thing to an honest question Rhen had ever heard him ask. "After everything you clearly already knew about how this was supposed to go." "I thought about it," Rhen said, honestly, because he had more than once in the 2 years leading up to that exact 15 feet. "Then I remembered the whole reason I came back wasn't to make sure you paid for what you did. It was to make sure nobody had to pay for it again. That includes you, whether you've earned it or not." Dorian didn't have an answer for that. Rhen didn't wait for one. Ward uptime 100%, 38 consecutive closures, kill board ranking unranked. Rhen Calder still holds an unranked, uncredited position on every public leaderboard the Vanguard Assembly maintains. Myra Solt, 23 consecutive closures into her own record, still gets asked at recruitment fairs why she chose just a warder instead of retesting for a combat class, and still gives the same answer every time: that she'd rather be the reason a team comes home than the reason anyone remembers a highlight reel. Varric Asen teaches a full annex now, first time in 8 years. The report that once got him blacklisted required reading for every new warder intake, filed under a name the Assembly finally bothered to attach credit to. Os still flies with Duskward Vanguard and still notices every mission since, exactly the moments Dorian used to count on nobody noticing at all. None of them ever made the kill board. None of the 38 gates they closed together produced a single headline. What they earned instead, walking away from an Ashen choir that wasn't supposed to open for another 4 years, was the only number that had ever actually mattered to any of them. Everyone who walked in, walked back out,